Hey, good afternoon. So apologies, I think you probably know I've got a little bit less time today than normal, so I'll crack on into it. As you know, this morning I met with Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott in Wellington. This is Mr Abbott's second official visit to New Zealand, and of course it has a distinctly Anzac focus to the visit. At breakfast today we discussed a wide range of issues as he summarised, I think, in his remarks, including ISIL, our joint training mission in Iraq, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the upcoming trip to Gallipoli. We also took stock of some of the issues we agreed to progress at our February meeting, including information sharing on deportations in the single economic market. Together we took part in the dedication ceremony of the Australian Memorial at Pukeahu. We also had the opportunity to visit the Te Papa exhibition called Gallipoli, The Scale of Our War. This remarkable exhibition is the work of Richard Taylor and the team at Weta. Over the weekend I attended the opening of the Pukeahu National War Memorial Park in Wellington alongside the Gigi. It's an outstanding memorial. Both the sound and light show and the Great War exhibition bring life to a time in New Zealand's history that we should all remember. The respect New Zealanders show for Anzac commemorations and the growing numbers who turn out, both young and old, serve to underline the importance of this event in our history. Given the extra special importance of Anzac commemorations this year, 100 years on from the landings at Gallipoli, a number of ministers are attending services and events both in and outside New Zealand. On Anzac morning itself, Deputy Prime Minister Bill English will be in Wellington and ministers will be attending Anzac events around the country. As you know, I'll be travelling to Gallipoli to attend events alongside 2,000 New Zealanders who won places in the ballot. I'll attend a number of commemorative services on the Gallipoli Peninsula on the 24th and 25th, including the Dawn service, the New Zealand service at Chunuk Bair, and the Australian service at Lone Pine. I'm delighted to be leading an official delegation on this trip, which includes Veterans Affairs Minister Craig Foss, 25 youth ambassadors, the Chief of Defence Lieutenant General Tim Keating, former Prime Minister Helen Clark, and Opposition Leader Andrew Little. New Zealand will, as I mentioned, be represented at other key events internationally. Minister Gerry Brownlee will commemorate Anzac Day at the New Zealand Memorial Service in Messines, Belgium. The Passchendaele battlefield has special significance for New Zealanders and remains the site of the worst military disaster in New Zealand's history. Minister Paula Bennett is travelling to France and will attend commemorations at battlefields that are significant to New Zealand, including Longyearbyen, where the remains of the unknown soldier were removed from in 2004 to be reburied at the National War Memorial in Wellington. And Minister Chris Finlayson will be in Australia attending the Dawn service, the Australian National Anzac Day ceremony, and the Last Post. He will also represent New Zealand at the Anzac Day ceremony hosted by the French Embassy in Canberra. Finally, the Speaker will be in London, will be laying the official New Zealand government wreath at the Dawn service at Hyde Park Corner. I'm pleased and proud to have New Zealand appropriately represented at these important international events. So I'll be leaving tomorrow evening to travel to Turkey. Following the Anzac events there, I'll then go onto a visit to a number of Gulf states, as I announced last week. I'll be accompanied by an 18-strong business delegation, and together we'll be working hard to promote Kiwi businesses and tell the New Zealand story in the Gulf. On Sunday the 26th, I'll be in Dubai, and we'll kick off the week-long trip with a speech at the Dubai Chamber of Commerce to open the New Zealand Dubai Business Seminar. I'll then be heading to Abu Dhabi for a number of high-level official calls and visits, followed by a full day in Dubai, where I'll be officially opening the New Zealand consulate. Finally, and continuing with a strong focus on trade and business, I'll spend a day in Saudi Arabia and a day in Kuwait. On this trip, I'll be meeting with a number of royal and government leaders, ministers, and other key officials. It's an opportunity to strengthen and grow trade and business links between the Gulf Cooperation Council, known as the GCC, and New Zealand. It also provides a chance to progress the conclusion of the New Zealand GCC Free Trade Agreement. We're making it a top priority to talk to leaders in the region about the importance of finalising this FTA. The GCC is New Zealand's 5th largest export destination, and New Zealand exports to the region are worth about $1.9 billion to us. Exports have grown by 10% over the last 10 years, so now it's an opportune time to showcase New Zealand's business and products to this important region. Obviously, the Middle East is the focus of a number of key security issues, including the international campaign against ISIL. So I expect to discuss these and other bilateral and international issues during my meetings. I'll return on the 2nd of May. Questions?
Are you aware of the case of Carolina Dam? That's the former Auckland woman who's now in Denmark, but her son has died in Syria.
Yeah, look, I really don't know the details. I've heard the name, obviously, but I really don't know any details outside of that.
Have you had any New Zealand parents have there been any cases of New Zealand parents contacting authorities concerned their children are potentially radicalised?
I'm not sure how much information I can really go into in that space. I certainly can't go into individuals, but it isn't uncommon. It's not unheard of for a family member to contact the police and then ultimately to talk to the SIS about concerns they might have for a loved one, becoming more attracted to messages from the likes of ISIL and the threat that they perceive that that person could become radicalised. So often family members are involved in discussions that lead to the SIS having discussions with those individuals.
The number of incidents, are we seeing more of those recently?
A little more, but it's quite a small group.
And has the SIS been effective in talking to those people?
Yeah, there are some people that we believe we've actually talked down from wanting to get engaged and leave. As I say, the number's quite small, but there are cases where family members do become very distressed and concerned by activity they see, and they approach, usually in the first instance, the police.
So is this them down?
SIS.
So this is obviously because you talked about 30 or 40 people who were of interest at one stage. These are included in that?
They may be people that well and truly had a discussion with SIS. Like some of those people will not be surprised that they're on that particular list. They probably would anticipate or expect to be there. They're not necessarily people where their family members have come to the police or the government authorities.
So we're talking a couple of dozen perhaps, or
it's probably less than that, but I'm certainly aware of some cases where there's been parental outreach, if you like, to authorities because of the concern they have for their children.
Double figures perhaps in the past year or so?
I don't think we're nearly as high as that.
And so when you say they've been talked down, do you mean they've been talked out of going to Syria?
Yeah, I mean the parents are concerned about what they see the youngsters getting up to. Sometimes they'll approach them and obviously have a discussion, but that's going nowhere. It's not completely unheard of that they would go and speak to effectively government agencies, the police or others, and ultimately the SIS may well have a discussion with the individual and talk more to them, and there's a process that they go through.
Have any passports been cancelled as a result of concerns that family members have raised?
There have been passports cancelled, but I can't be absolutely sure that they're aligned to people where parents have raised concerns with officials. But as you know, with the new laws that we have available, as long as they meet the legal criteria, passports can be cancelled.
Do you have an updated figure as to how many passports have been cancelled?
I don't have it on the top of my head.
Have you got an updated figure as to how many New Zealanders have travelled to Iraq or Syria to join Islamic State?
I don't think it's dramatically changed from where we were some months ago. I certainly haven't been advised it's dramatically changed.
So that's
Tony,
the five that you mentioned in your Iraq speech?
Yep, might be a little more than that, but not a lot more.
Tony Abbott continues to compare the joint mission to Iraq with the Gallipoli campaign. Do you consider that appropriate?
I think what he was trying to say was just simply that in Gallipoli was the first example of Australians and New Zealanders working together, if you like. That's the formalisation of the Anzac bombs. And I think he was just simply saying this is another example of Australia and New Zealand working together. That's the way I would interpret it.
What did you think of his use of the word phrase sons of Anzac?
Oh, look, I think he was just looking for a particular phrase and chose that one.
What do you think we should learn out of Gallipoli? What do you think we should learn?
Well, there are many lessons. I mean, hindsight's a wonderful thing. I mean, obviously it was, at the core of it, a terrible loss for New Zealand and New Zealand men. It was a campaign which, in a lot of instances, terribly wrong. But it was 100 years ago, and probably our knowledge of warfare and modern warfare is quite different from that. I mean, I think the way we tend to think of it is not so much in the battle, although that's obviously something that we learn about and understand. But its most significance is because that was the time we, I think, we really formed those bonds with Australia and what that ultimately meant.
Is that an appropriate banner though, Tony Abbott calling our troops that are going to Iraq the sons of Anzac?
Like I say, I mean, I can't speak for him, but I just made the assumption he was just trying to simply say this is another example of where we work together.
A few years ago, I think it was the 90th commemorations, when Helen Clark and John Howard were both on the Gallipoli Peninsula.
Yes.
There was some controversy about Helen Clark going to Lone Pine, but Mr. Howard not coming
Yes,
to
I
the
remember that.
Chinook Bear celebrations or commemorations, I should say. Is Mr. Abbott going to come to the Chinook Bear ones this time?
I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure he's coming to Chinook Bear. I certainly hope he does. It would be nice if he does. I mentioned to him this morning that obviously I'd get Lone Pine would send to Chinook Bear, but I can't 100% confirm.
Because in that case, the controversy was around
We went down
Mr.
to
Howard
barbecue.
deciding to have a barbecue, and it was seen as not in the Anzac spirit.
Yeah.
So you hope he'll come.
I hope he'll come, yeah.
The foreign
In terms of
fighters issue.
Iraq, so there's reports out of Australia that Iran is going to provide intelligence to Australian forces there. Is the same going to be happening?
Well, I think that's come on the back of Julie Bishop's visit to Iran, is that right, to Tehran? Certainly, I'm not aware of any agreement for information sharing between Iran and New Zealand. So I don't know whether they're really talking about a formalised thing, or whether they'll just be sharing information.
On the foreign fighters issue, have any of the ones that you talked about, have they gone through Turkey and to use that border to get into Syria?
It's possible, but generally the advice I get from SAs is not to talk about the route that people use.
Given that though, would you be, when you're in Turkey, talking to the Turkish leadership about that issue of foreign fighters and whether or not they could do anything more to stop the likes of Kiwis and Aussies going through?
Yeah. Well, look, I would expect the conversations we'll have with President Erdogan will be a bit of a summary of what we see out of New Zealand, the kind of scale of the issue in New Zealand, the sense we have of people that have gone off to fight for ISIL, and maybe a sense of how they're travelling, but whether they're going through Iraq, because there's a number of, through Turkey, because there's a number of ways of actually getting there. But I think we'll thank them for everything they can do to try and slow that process down.
Because Tony Abbott says that most of the Australians that have joined Islamic State have travelled through Turkey. So would you say that most of the New Zealanders have travelled
I
through
don't think I'd
as
be
well?
absolutely be able to assure that, say that, because I don't know with the route of every single person that's gone. I just know that there's been a variety of different groups, and they've just told me in the past not to talk about that because it just encourages people to have a way of knowing who'll be there.
And that little more than 5 people, are they in Syria and Iraq or just Syria?
Predominantly in Syria.
Is there any hope of Team New Zealand getting any more money out of the government?
There will be I expect there to be further discussions between Stephen Joyce and Grant Dalton, but I think it's extremely unlikely that there'll be any more money for Team New Zealand. We put up $5 million. We really believe there could be some more value for the New Zealand taxpayer if there was a regatta held in part or in full in New Zealand, but for a regatta sailed solely in Bermuda, I think it makes it really difficult to make the case for more funding.
So would you consider a proposal without an Auckland regatta, or is that off the table?
Realistically, I don't think that's likely that there would be more money without a regatta in Auckland, but of course don't forget Team New Zealand at least would argue that they're going through an arbitration case at the moment. I just can't rule out Stephen Joyce continues to talk to Grant Dalton, but I don't think any material form is likely.
So do you think that $5 million already spent is money well spent?
Well, I think it was necessary to hold the team together, and it was an important next step for them as they look to build their private sector donors. And in fairness to them, and fairness to probably us, we were at least optimistic that there was a chance of being, a regatta here in New Zealand.
Just on our troops in Iraq, you said this morning that the advice has been from New Zealand not to say when they've been over there. Will you tell us when they are there? I mean, what point will we know that they're there?
Well, they're going to be there in the early part of May. So I mean, there's so much that you know that. I really feel the need for me to tell you. I can probably try and update you guys, but I mean, it's just everything else we've done. We're completely open. The defence's view to us is if we say the exact day they leave and therefore the exact day they arrive, they perceive, for whatever reasons you'd ask them, but they perceive that puts a slight increase in risk on their safety. And so I've got no option but to accept that. But we know that we're starting that capability in the early part of May, so the middle to late part of May, so we need to have them there.
Prime Minister, is it not true that at least some troops went with the Australians last week?
I don't have all of those details. You have
But
to.
is that true or not?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. I just need to check that. There are some people, it's not a straightforward picture because people have gone to Australia and back. There may well be some people who are in Iraq. I'm just not advised of the sort of operational movements because I never would be advised of that. It's not because they don't go all in one day or in one particular thing. They go in various different tranches. So Jerry Brownlee's office would have it, or certainly CDF would have it, but I'm not aware of that. It's quite possible there are some people there.
It's back on the
Do you
New
have
Zealand
much
foreign
look at-
fighters. Is it fewer than 8 that are in Iraq and Syria?
Look, it's more than 5 and it's not a really big number, so yeah, it's a number very around that.
Given what's
Why-
happened in Australia, is there any possibility of domestic Anzac Day attacks or anything like that here?
Is there a risk? I don't have any specific advice that would support the view that there would be a likely attack, but I think there is always, increased risk when you have these sort of public events, and that's just the stock standard advice I get, whether it's a co-hosting of a Cricket World Cup or a Rugby World Cup or a very significant event like Anzac Day. Arguably, there's always a slightly increased risk, but I don't have any specific risk or specific advice around risk in the way that Australians did.
Do you agree with what Abbott said this morning, that Australians should turn up in their numbers to kind of thumb their nose at those proposing such attacks?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you don't do that, if people stay away, then they're giving in to the threat of these terrorists. But I'm very confident that you'll see a huge number of New Zealanders attending events. I mean, without question, I think there will be record attendance around the country. That's going to be a great thing. It's a great way of honouring those men that fought for our country in the Gallipoli campaign. But it'll also be a great way of I think, acknowledging service and sacrifice of the tens of thousands of people who have died over the history of New Zealand's involvement in war.
This morning, when you talked about IS targeting people trying to take domestic territory, so are you saying that the risk of that is greater during the Anzac commemorations?
Well, I'm just saying typically the advice we get is that for any large public scale event, there's always a slightly more heightened risk, but I don't have any specific risk about Anzac Day commemorations in New Zealand, unlike what the Australians have.
Do you think that would turn people away from turning up to these events?
I don't think so. I think most people will say this is a time that we should go out and actually physically show through our presence our appreciation for those that fight for the values and principles of our country, people that currently do that, people that have historically done that. I think there's a lot of pride in the way New Zealand's conducted itself and how it stood up for what it believes in over a course of the two world wars and various other campaigns.
What do you think of the Reserve Bank's intervention and debate about capital gains tax mostly?
I don't think capital gains tax would work if that's what Grant Spencer was talking about in terms of a short-term problem as he would define it in Auckland. Because in reality, if you want to put a capital gains tax on, firstly, we would have to go to the electorate and campaign on it because we specifically said we wouldn't. So there's no way I would implement the capital gains tax if there was basically if we didn't have a mandate from the people of New Zealand. There already is a capital gains tax, and how that's applied is always open for debate, but a new capital gains tax is not something we're proposing. Second thing is it would take a couple of years to theoretically devise that. And the third thing is the advice we always have was it takes a decade to get any revenue. So it's not a short-term fix, if that's what the point that Grant Spencer was making. He did make in that speech a number of other points, I thought. He talked about supply ultimately being the way to resolve the issue. He did talk about whether there's a need for more apartments, something I've spoken of before. He did talk about RMA reform, I think, and other areas. So the point is that I just don't think if his issue is about rising house prices, capital gains tax has proven to be quite ineffective in resolving that issue. It can raise some revenue, but in terms of resolving that issue, it hasn't worked in other countries.
You highlighted the timeliness of any response, which seemed to be at the centre of what he was saying, that we need to do something shorter than 2 years, for instance, which is the time frame he put on RMA reform and various other things. What can the government do that would have an immediate impact?
Well, the Reserve Bank or the government could take some steps. I mean, it's not like there are no steps. I mean, we still think the primary response is on the supply side. But there are always things that you can consider, and there are discussions that are held between the Minister of Finance and the Reserve Bank around any other options they might have available to them, or we might want to consider. And we've always said we're happy to continue in those discussions, and I think last week I